Humans, by their very nature, are adapted to seek out and identify patterns. It is one of those innate traits of human nature that help to define the human experience. When fretting over how to start this script, I thought a lot about what my launching point should be to justify a comparison that many make nonchalantly and yet never really dive in deeper. The issue with popular opinion is that it is constantly changing based on a multitude of different factors. The winds of change will always blow, and almost overnight, something that was popularly thought of as the greatest or best ever is now poorly aged, was never good, overrated, or overhyped, etc. As a Sonic fan, I've seen this happen a lot with successive generations of Sonic fans, but the same can also be clearly seen in the world of movies and music as well. Thanks to the internet, these changes in popular opinion can be nearly impossible to follow if you aren't there as it's happening. I'm sometimes inclined to believe that it's just a bandwagon of people who want to have a different opinion for the sake of sounding as though they are more informed or culturally aware or other kind of extra special than others, but I have no real evidence to back up that case. I say this because I recently learned that opinions about the Dreamcast seem to be more mixed than I assumed. It might just be because I have always had the most exposure to collectors and those who grew up with the release of the Dreamcast, whose nostalgia and love for the console were, and still are, a big part of their channel personality. Perhaps it was always the case that the Dreamcast was as niche as it always seems these days. It had me thinking a lot, and then I noticed another pattern that just so happened to coincide with the theme of this video and its script. At the very beginning of the 6th generation of consoles, the main contenders battling for supremacy were Sega's Dreamcast and Sony's PlayStation 2. This wasn't a long bout, however. It was only just after the announcement of the Nintendo GameCube and the Xbox that the Dreamcast had to be discontinued. Sega had run out of money, and the Dreamcast could not move enough units within a certain period that could make the console economically viable. The PlayStation 2 beat out the Dreamcast, but that wasn't the end. The PlayStation 2 went on to become the best-selling console of all time, trouncing the GameCube and the Xbox, and still moving units until its final discontinuation in 2013, as Sony prepared for the launch of the PlayStation 4. Because of the nearly universal popularity of the PlayStation 2, there continues to be a lot of love and nostalgia for it. It carries its own aesthetic in its design and presentation of games that it is undeniably one of those cultural icons that transcends national borders, and the relentless march of time and the waxing and waning of cultural trends it brings. The Dreamcast isn't so fortunate. Even in its time and in its home country, the Dreamcast was popularly known as the enthusiast machine. It was for the most hardcore of gamers, who were going to be there for the PlayStation 2 the day it came out in the same way they were there for the release of the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast's hardcore following is famous, then, for having a strong affection for it, praising everything it was doing and its various features it seemingly pioneered long before its competitors would eventually go in that same direction. It was a feature-rich technological trendsetter, and while its short life meant that its game library isn't anywhere near as expansive as its Sony rival, its passionate fan base show a devotion to it and the games it does have in a way that is unparalleled among fans of any other console. I personally remember videos comparing graphics between Dreamcast and Xbox 360 games, claiming that the Dreamcast was on the same level of fidelity as the Xbox 360. Because of this, I can kind of understand how there would be the backlash against the Dreamcast and the reputation for high-quality games and hardware that some of its strongest devotees have sworn by in the past. Okay, so where is the pattern? Well, the Dreamcast has a number of very famous games, many of which remain Japanese exclusives. But one game that defined the Dreamcast early in its short life, and one that served something as a manifesto for the Dreamcast and its forecast for the future of gaming in the 21st century, was Shenmue. At the time, Shenmue was the most expensive game ever made and had an unprecedented attention to detail, which it is still noted for today. Shenmue has been lauded since its release as being among the best games ever made, and was even featured on the list of 1001 games you must play before you die, if that still holds any cultural cachet. It was groundbreaking and revolutionary at the time, both technologically and artistically, as it helped to redefine storytelling in games and contributed to the argument that games are, in fact, art. All of that is true, but if it were as easy as Shenmue was and is so acclaimed, then it wouldn't really make sense that the series hasn't even concluded after 26 years, with the series' future always being in question. The fact is that for every lover of Shenmue, you are bound to have people who either hate the game or never heard of it, that completely outnumber them by a sizable margin. Shenmue is a game that everyone who knows it either absolutely loves it or hates it. And because of that, the game is relegated to the category of cult classic. There are plenty of reasons for this, which will become apparent later as I describe the game, but I can't help but to see Shenmue's popularity with its fans being somewhat similar to the Dreamcast's popularity with its fans relative to those outside. The number of fans of Shenmue is not so numerous, and this subculture is already so closely tethered to the die-hard Dreamcast fans, it's almost a no-brainer to see the correlation between the two. In 2005, Sega, under a different development team, released the first game in the Yakuza series for PlayStation 2. Starting out as a slow burn at first, the series ended up blowing up into massive success with the release of the Kiwami remakes of the first two games and Yakuza 0 on the PlayStation 3. The series to this day continues to enjoy massive success and near annual releases of both main story games as well as spin-off games. I would personally argue that the Yakuza series has become about as recognizable a Sega property as Sonic the Hedgehog, which is no easy feat considering the countless attempts by Sega in the 90s to create other properties that would become as popular as Sonic on their consoles. While the trajectory of its success is a bit different than its parent hardware, ultimately, as far as Sega is concerned, the Yakuza series does enjoy quite similar success as the PlayStation 2 when you consider the series' own success in the mainstream. Compared to Shenmue, the Yakuza series is to it like the PlayStation 2 is to the Dreamcast as far as popularity and niche audiences go. That might be a bit of a shaky way of looking at the popularity differential between the two series, but when I think about the cultural attitudes surrounding these pieces of software and hardware, I can't help but to see that kind of pattern, as I mentioned in the introductory paragraph of this script. But one of the most intriguing things about Yakuza and Shenmue is that if you were to create a Venn diagram of fans of the two series, it would likely look like two circles. Shenmue fans that I've seen seem to react to the Yakuza series as being too different from Shenmue to necessitate calling Yakuza a spiritual successor. Meanwhile, Yakuza fans I've seen seem to be in the hate category for Shenmue, and usually cite the Yakuza games as the example of what Shenmue should have been. Yet, despite this dichotomy, this very clear binary, it's hard to hear a conversation about one series without the other getting at least a passing mention, one way or the other. What I find strange is how people will speak of the other game in comparative terms, and for more than a decade now, I've been fascinated by how these games compare and contrast with each other. As I mentioned before, Shenmue fans tend to say that Yakuza strays too far from the formula of Shenmue, and Yakuza fans lambaste Shenmue for having archaic systems and having a story that is so slowly paced it feels like too little is accomplished by the game's end, at least from my cursory findings. With this video, I want to compare the games of each series, this video focusing specifically on Shenmue and Yakuza, the first games. With this series, Shenmue 1, Shenmue 2, that will be easy, but for Shenmue 3, well, we'll burn that bridge when we get there. The goal I have here is to play through each of these games and see just what about these games are similar, that they are compared despite what makes them so vastly different as to have such little crossover between them and their fan bases. The goal here isn't to determine which game is better, since that is highly dependent on who is playing each game. So if you came here looking for a quality judgment in that regard, you're not going to get it from me. I don't really find those types of comparisons particularly useful or interesting anyway, so I hope that clarifies where I'm coming from with this comparison. Despite what I just finished saying, I understand that no matter how objective I try to be, there may be instances where I might not be as objective in my script as I strive to be. In this section, I want to briefly disclose my opinions of each game before going into the comparison itself. For the sake of keeping things as apples to apples as possible, I played each game on their native hardware in Japanese. I will not be considering the HD remaster of Yakuza or Shenmue, and will not be discussing Yakuza Kiwami either. Those can be reserved for a separate video, but those are outside the scope of my aim for this video. So we have Shenmue running off the real discs off a real Dreamcast, and Yakuza running off its real discs off a real PlayStation 2. As for Yakuza, or I guess Yakuza for my American people, I really enjoyed the game. I've heard people characterize it as something like GTA in Japan, but I highly disagree. Maybe if taken along the lines of the story or the nature of the story, I can see points of similarity, but overall I do feel that there's more separating Yakuza and GTA in a gameplay sense than there is between Shenmue and Yakuza, which is why I don't plan on including a GTA comparison into this mix, although I did consider it at one point. But Yakuza is a really well-made game published late into the PS2's life that exemplifies the best of what was possible at the time on the PS2. In my opinion, it is right up there with the best of the games made exclusively for it. It has a great mix of story and gameplay and a level of interactivity with its world that was still pretty granular for its time. It really is a great showcase for the console, and a really great start to a series that would eventually become a AAA blockbuster title for Sega. But I think the real question is what I feel about Shenmue. As I mentioned before, you either love it or hate it. So, where in that binary do I lie? I have to admit, I'm in the love it category. Look, I always knew I would love Shenmue based on what I heard about it. Something about its approach to world building and its fighting mechanics really sounded appealing to me. And the game didn't disappoint. In fact, it didn't just live up to my expectations, but it surpassed them. Shenmue is one of those games whose appeal to me is difficult to describe with any semblance of brevity. But if I could just mention a few surface level things, the really granular attention to detail, the very Japanese aesthetics, and how the game really does feel like it is living in a small corner of a Japanese city. I really like the story and the way it is presented, including the story's pacing, which I'll talk about later. The way the story and gameplay are seamlessly combined helps make Shenmue, despite its age, a very immersive and engaging experience if you are inclined to this kind of story-driven experience in games. Now that I've disclosed my personal feelings about these games, at least in broad terms, hopefully my feelings about the games won't influence my comparison between them, since it's supposed to be objective anyway. But just in case, there it is. Kiryu Kazuma happens to have been born the same year as Hazuki Ryo. Kazuma, however, went down a much different path than Ryo, becoming involved from an early age with the Dojima family of the Tojo clan of the Yakuza. He rose quickly through the ranks of the Tojo clan and eventually became the clan's fourth chairman, if only for a brief time. Despite being Yakuza, or as of the story of the first game, former Yakuza, he has a strong sense of compassion and integrity that might be surprising to those who are aware of the reputation of the Yakuza. Kazuma's reputation can be defined in short terms by the large dragon tattoo he has on his back. The Dragon of Dojima carries a fierce reputation that even those who claim not to be afraid of him secretly are. Like Ryo, Kazuma is a skilled fighter, but Kazuma is a fighter in a different way. While Ryo is trained in classical martial arts and is much more traditional in his style, Kazuma is a straight fighter, much in line with that of a member of a major Yakuza clan. He fights dirty, using weapons ranging from park benches, promotional store signs, baseball bats, metal pipes, and even stun guns, my personal favorite. While Kazuma doesn't strive to be a killer, he does have a body count by the end of Yakuza, whereas Ryo doesn't kill anyone through the events of Shenmue. No, not even Chai. Kazuma can't help some of the fatalities, though, especially considering all the bombs and guns that are used at the end of Yakuza. But I think where these two characters really diverge the most is in their demeanor. Ryo is stoic and cool, but due to his youth, he has a lot to prove and must earn the fear from those who stand in his way. Kazuma has already earned this reputation. Not only has he just finished serving a 10-year sentence in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but he was the protege of Kazuma Shintaro, a brutal Yakuza boss. Because of this, Kazuma's coolness manifests itself in a stern, threatening kind of way, in a similar style as Darth Vader's mere appearance was enough to intimidate his subordinates and dissuade anyone from obstructing his path to accomplishing his mission. If someone thinks they are strong enough to take him on, then Kazuma will show them what it means to challenge him to a physical altercation. These two characters are similar in a number of ways, especially when it comes to fights. Kazuma finds himself getting into many more fights than Ryo, but that is likely a byproduct of his having once been a high-ranking member of a major Yakuza clan, and street thugs and low-ranking gangsters wanting to take him on for the clout. That being said, Kazuma hardly ever goes out of his own way to pick fights with others, very similarly to Ryo. Almost all of the fights come to him, save for the mission he goes on late in Yakuza to rescue Haruka from Lao Ka Long, which I can't help but to be reminded of the kidnapping of Nozomi by Chai and the fights it spawned in Shenmue, including the 70-man bout. I think overall that Ryo and Kazuma are very similar protagonists in a big picture lens. When you look at them a bit closer, however, there are a number of differences that begin to show in their dispositions and the worlds around them. Ryo is not much more than just another school kid, and despite his father being a martial arts master, he isn't really that special except for the fact that his father was killed. Kazuma has a lot more social clout and commands a much more universal sense of respect in his world. Even people who haven't met him before have at least heard of him, and most of the time treat him with a level of deference that, were they not to, would be a grave mistake for them, unless you're Haruka. Kazuma's world isn't exactly centered around him in that it revolves around him, but this position in that society is such that people stay out of his way, or if they do get in his way, it's for some serious reason, which usually has serious consequences. I would say then, in this respect, that Ryo's world relative to him feels a lot more realistic, whereas Kazuma's feels a lot more like the plot to a video game, where he is definitely the main character. Ryo's world is mostly indifferent to him unless he becomes an agitator to get a response, whereas Kazuma's world has a number of people of different ranks and associations out to get him, and those close to him. When I think about this contrast, I think about Kazuma and Ryo in relation to their main antagonists. It takes kicking and screaming for Ryo to get sometimes frustratingly weak leads and hits to seek out Lan Di, so that he can avenge his father. Meanwhile, Kazuma just wants to get on with his life, but the trouble of his past life as a high-ranking, fearsome Yakuza keeps inviting more people to come after him or bait him into an encounter. There are similarities between Ryo and Kazuma, but when I think about what would happen if Kazuma were in the same story as Ryo, I think Lan Di would likely find some way to either draw Kazuma out or go directly to him, rather than just leave him behind and ignore his existence like he does to Ryo. I think it really goes to show that the biggest difference between these two characters is their respective importance to their main antagonist. Sure, Chai does eventually come out and try to attack Ryo at the very end, but Chai is just a low-ranking henchman of little consequence in the grand scheme of things. Meanwhile, people like Nishikiyama Akira or Goro Majima seek out Kazuma proactively, even when Kazuma would much rather be left alone. They are both unwilling protagonists, thrust into their own respective stories by events perpetrated by actions of others. One as the result of collateral damage, the other as the target. And I believe it is this that exists at the core of their stories that ultimately defines the gulf in their characters that forms despite the similarities they seem to share at first glance. One thing that both Shenmue and Yakuza have in common is that both games are heavily story-driven games. I don't know where I first saw it, but there was at least one place where I saw that both games were situated under the genre of cinedrama. They both utilize some form of cinematic storytelling that helps to drive the gameplay and serve as a motivator for both the player and the in-game characters as well. How similar are their stories? First off, of course, the stories aren't the same at all, but the differences don't end there either. Neither of these games really share the same storytelling style, and each have tones that are distinct from one another. Yakuza these days especially is more known and enjoyed for being quite zany. This is a tradition that started admittedly early in the franchise's history, honestly, probably beginning with one of the earlier side quests in Yakuza 2. But the first game is played much more seriously. Majima is portrayed more like a real, dangerous, loose cannon, a guy who has lost his mind so totally he has lost even his sense of self-preservation. In this game, he kind of reminds me of a Japanese interpretation of the Heath Ledger Joker from the Dark Knight trilogy. He's meant to be intimidating, in contrast to his modern depiction of being more like a clown, I guess, strongly reflecting the series' overall tonal change over the last 20 years or so. That's all to say that the first Yakuza is a lot more serious than even its Kiwami remakes, and this tonal difference may or may not be jarring to those who got into the series since the release of Zero or the Kiwami remakes. The story revolves around Kazuma and the remnants of his connections to the Tojo clan of Yakuza, for whom he was once a high-ranking member. He gets sucked back into it shortly after taking the fall for a murder he did not commit to protect Nishikiyama Akira, a brother of sorts to him, whom Kazuma bears an uncanny resemblance with the exception of their tattoos, Kazuma's being a dragon and Akira's being a koi fish. 10 billion yen has gone missing from the Tojo clan, and Akira is out to kill Kazuma. Kazuma eventually ends up running into a girl, Haruka, who has some connection to Yumi, a woman who had gone missing, who is also at the center of the murder, and suspected to be directly related in some way to the 10 billion yen. Kazuma and Haruka wade through the drama of the underground and organized criminal dealings, as well as gang and street violence in order to get to the bottom of this mystery, ultimately culminating in the deaths of virtually everyone they encounter, including Nishikiyama Akira, Yumi, and the patriarch of the Tojo clan, Kazama, among others. There are street fights, alleyway ambushes, coliseum fights, assassination attempts, highway chases, bombs, you name it. In many ways, Yakuza plays a lot like a classic Japanese-style crime, thriller, drama film from the 70s or 80s. It carries a lot of that aesthetic in its cinematography, performances by the voice cast, the writing of both the overall story as well as the dialogue, and its general presentation. The only thing that sets it apart from those movies is that because it is essentially all animated, the scale that the action can take can far surpass what those older movies could. All that being said, it is a very engaging story, and the way it is separated into chapters makes the game feel very easily digestible. These segmentations allow for the player to have the focus redirected. If they were away from the game for a long time, it would be possible for them to be quickly reminded of where they left off and what they needed to do next. Not that it is necessarily easy to get lost in this game, but I'll save that for later. But still, Yakuza's story is easy to follow and equally easy to unintentionally end up sinking several hours at a time into just to see what happens next. Its pacing is pretty much exactly as one might expect the pacing for a game of this kind to be like, with maybe the exception of a part of the midsection, which I will also go into further depth about later. All that being said, in my experience with the game, I felt that Yakuza fits in perfectly as part of the image of PlayStation exclusive as it was during its peak late in the PS2's life. In this way, I think it was a success. Shenmue's story is quite different from Yakuza's. While there is one point early in the game where Ryo can go to the Nagai office where the local Yakuza conduct their business to answer a question about the tattoo parlor and Ryo's later entanglement with the Mad Angels, Ryo himself never becomes actively involved in organized crime. He never was nor never becomes a member. He is more or less your typical Japanese high school student who happens to be the son of a recently murdered martial arts master. This is the whole catalyst to the plot of Shenmue. I will mention on a number of occasions in this video Shenmue's close attention to detail and its story focus being very granular. While there is a promise for a grand adventure in Shenmue, that adventure does not take place in Shenmue. Instead, this story acts more as a prologue to the adventure, and as a result, despite the 15-25 hour runtime of the game, if you were to look at a plot summary, it would be quite brief. I think what makes the story feel so off-putting for so many people, especially now in the age of clickbait and influencer culture, that it's really easy to look at Shenmue and say, all that and nothing in the story actually happens. While I can see where this line of thinking comes from, I believe that a story like this one that takes place in Shenmue isn't aiming for the cinematic style of storytelling that many associate with other more mainstream story-driven games, like the Yakuza series, or Metal Gear Solid, or even The Last of Us. The best way I can describe the nature of Shenmue's storytelling in contrast to Yakuza's is that while Yakuza's is like a crime thriller from the 70s or 80s, Shenmue's story is more like a multi-volume novel from the 1950s or so. I don't know how many influencers or games journalists have read the longer works of Japanese literature aside from manga, but in general, a lot of these multi-volume novels pay very close attention to the minutiae of life. Their storytelling advances at a pace that isn't exactly along the lines of the conventions of more popular forms of print media. That doesn't necessarily mean that the author doesn't respect the time of their reader. It just means that there is a purpose behind what is being presented. In Shenmue's case, my interpretation of it at least, is to show just how small and impotent in the world Ryo is. His father is a well-respected and well-known martial artist, yet even in his own hometown, people only see him as a high school kid and don't really take him seriously at face value. He does earn their respect, some of them at least, but his journey to confronting Lan Di is going to take him overseas to Hong Kong. If he has to work this hard just to get a ferry ride to Hong Kong from his hometown, how important can Ryo actually be? It puts Ryo into the context of the rest of the world. He really isn't the main character in the world. Its logic and the NPCs around him show him no greater deference to anyone else they meet. He is as much an NPC to them as they are to the player. And I think that is why Shenmue is as restrictive as it can sometimes be, especially in the opening days of the game's story. The story ultimately follows Hazuki Ryo doing everything he can to find the whereabouts of Lan Di, the man who killed his father, so that he can get his revenge. Over the course of the game's story, we discover even greater mysteries surrounding the incident, including the questions as to why Lan Di was there in the first place, and what relationship he and his father had with the Dragon and Phoenix mirrors, and what's so important about these mirrors in the first place. The story culminates in Ryo's encounter with Guijang Chen and his father, a showdown with the Mad Angels, and a final bout with the game's final boss, Chai, before Ryo earns his way to Hong Kong in his victory through Master Chen paying for his ferry ride. Yeah, not much really happens in the grand scheme of things, but it's Shenmue Volume 1, essentially. This is the catalyst and the very beginning of a much broader story. Self-contained if need be, but meant to be only the start to a story conceptualized to span several episodes. It's almost like Star Wars, except Shenmue does the audience a courtesy to start from the beginning rather than the middle. The cast of characters in Shenmue aren't really as numerous as in Yakuza, and the story is told strictly from Ryo's point of view. If something happens in Ryo's absence, he hears about it from others, with the only exception being the cutaways we get of Chai whenever he is eavesdropping. But even then, in those cases, Ryo is always present in those scenes. Characters in Shenmue, even those close to Ryo, don't really conspire with or get directly involved with Ryo to the same extent as those in Yakuza, with the exception being Guijang Chen, who is assigned to be Ryo's bodyguard, and his increasing meddling in uncovering the location of Lan Di and association to his father invites dangerous associates to Lan Di, like Chai, to track him down. Ryo and Guijang both participate in the 70-man bout and work as a team to take out the Mad Angels' leader, Terry, to settle an old rivalry. This story exists at a much smaller scale than the story in Yakuza. There are no highway chases with people hanging outside of cars shooting at each other, no bombings of boats or sniping rival clan members through windows, and definitely no newsworthy events like the huge explosion that effectively destroys a sentry tower at the end of Yakuza. No. Shenmue is not about that kind of grandeur. There is instead more of an emphasis on the personal journey of Ryo and the mastery and mysticism that he is made aware of over the course of the game. The only real property damage that takes place is during the chase scenes in Dobuita or Yokosuka Harbor. There is a highway section, but it's not a chase, it's more like a race to the harbor to save Nozomi, and the motorcycle isn't stolen like it might have been in a game like Yakuza. Instead, Ryo borrows it from his childhood friend Yuji. No questions asked, too. Yuji is a real bro. Some fans of the Yakuza series might argue that the story of Shenmue should have had the kind of scale and pacing, or at least something similar as Yakuza. But in Shenmue's case, I really do feel that that kind of change in direction would have done more harm to the story than good. It's very apparent that the story Shenmue is telling is being told deliberately in its current style. That is to say, that Shenmue's storytelling method is not a mistake. These sorts of criticisms, for me at least, seem to be operating on the basis that Shenmue is full of mistakes, and this assumption is based solely on the preferences of those who are saying so. They point to a game like Yakuza as an example of what Shenmue's story ought to be, without considering if the way Shenmue is intending to tell his story is supposed to have the same direction as Yakuza to begin with. For both of these games, the gameplay is something that really drives the stories further, so I'll explain on why in the gameplay section later, but already we are beginning to see the differences between Shenmue and Yakuza are starting to become something a bit wider than mere scattered gaps. The best word I've heard used to describe Shenmue is granular, and that's thanks to how much attention to detail there is in the world it presents. It's likely that one of the main points of comparison between Shenmue and Yakuza is that their worlds are both open, take place in virtual approximations of real locations in Japan, and have a certain level of interactivity within those worlds that wasn't entirely common in games, especially of that generation. Yakuza has a very rich and large world. While of course it comes nowhere near to the scale of even Grand Theft Auto 3 in terms of overall area, it was still a pretty uncommon phenomenon, especially at this level of graphical fidelity. Yakuza allows the player to interact with a wide range of different objects in the game. There is a whole section in the middle of the game where the story kind of stops and Kazuma must entertain Haruka for a while to pass the time until the player can trigger the next story section. You can go to the game center to play the UFO catcher game to win prizes. You can go to the batting cages to practice your baseball hitting skills. You can go to karaoke. You can buy snacks at the convenience store. Yakuza also offers a number of side quests that you can do to earn some extra money or unlock extra cutscenes. This can be done simply by interacting with NPCs you run into on the street and talking to them. This can be anything from exacting justice on a school bully, getting scammed at a bar and getting your revenge, or chasing down a regular thief. Yakuza is also known for helping to introduce the images and sounds of unique Japanese brands to an international audience. We shall never forget the memes that were spawned by the Don Quixote theme song that went viral on Instagram and TikTok, for instance. In my playthrough of Yakuza, I have copyright claims on every video where I walk into one of these stores, since the whole theme song plays on loop while you're shopping, and that song is copyrighted. But that is part of the charm and aesthetic of Yakuza. It brings to life an aspect of Japan that for countless many, especially at that time, was not exactly possible to see or experience in real life. This even goes down to the seedier parts of Japanese popular culture, like host clubs and cabaret theaters. And what makes Yakuza unique in this regard is that these aspects of Japanese culture aren't sensationalized like they might be in the hands of someone to whom Japan is foreign. The world of Yakuza is excitement, entertainment, thrills, and drama. Not unlike the real-world Kabukicho, Tokyo's own wretched hive of scum and villainy. All of these words I use to describe Yakuza's world cannot be used to describe Yokosuka. One thing people need to understand where narrative is concerned is that the setting is also extremely important. as the setting usually has an active hand in influencing the kind of story that can be told. Shenmue takes place 19 years prior to the events of Yakuza, save for the game's prologue. This is a version of Japan that is completely different, arguably taking place during the height of the bubble era, in the waning years of the Showa era. It takes place in Yokosuka, a major port city with a US Navy base, and an extremely busy and famous harbor. The population here, then, is a lot more diverse. It might be predominantly Japanese, of course, but there are other nationalities present as well. Obviously, Americans, thanks to the sailors based at the naval base. There are also a lot of Chinese as well, some who even emigrated to Japan before the war. It's a very niche movie, but one of my favorite movies that I think does a lot to help capture the atmosphere of Yokosuka Harbor around this time was Shion Sono's The Room. Life on and around the harbor can sometimes feel like a grind that drones on forever, and after work, these dock workers will relax by taking the bus to places like Dobuita with a mild nightlife and enjoy a late night of drinking together before returning home, going to sleep, waking up, and living the routine all over again the next day. Japan might have been at the height of its party spawned by its post-war economic miracle. Since it's built on the back of these blue-collar workers, the party is muted here, and the real party is taking place further inland in places like Tokyo. This is the world that Hazuki Ryo comes from. Shenmue's story seems to plod along at an agonizing pace, and that is by design. Shenmue's world is also much smaller, and each area of it, Yamanose, Sakuragaoka, Dobuita, and the harbor, are all separated by loading screens, as opposed to Yakuza's more seamless world. This is, of course, thanks to a lot of the memory limitations of the Dreamcast, but Shenmue proves to be a lot more than what meets the eye. Shenmue provides a much closer view of the world to the player than Yakuza, where Yakuza assumes a more bird's eye view and more cinematic camera angles, more on that later because it is narratively important. Shenmue places the camera directly behind Ryo and gives the player the opportunity to even assume a first-person view to get a closer look at certain details in the world. Yakuza might have an attention to detail that is impressive in its own right, but Shenmue remains unsurpassed in this regard, at least between these two games. I really feel that Shenmue's microscopic attention to detail goes criminally underappreciated. The kind of interactivity offered in Shenmue alone was unprecedented, only with games like Duke Nukem 3D even coming close. Interactivity is one thing, but one of the things that makes this aspect even more impressive of Shenmue is the fact that it is a necessary element of the game and is meant to be an immersive way for the player to interact with the game to find real-world-like solutions to in-game problems. In this sense, it is much less gamey than Yakuza. Where's the tattoo parlor? Well, you could talk to these two bikers at the game center and lie, telling them that you want a tattoo, and they'll tell you to go to Okayama Heights. Or, if you say you don't want to get a tattoo, then you can visit the Nagai office, where the local Yakuza branch is located, and ask them, where they will tell you it's at something Heights. Either way, in order to find this place, you will have to consult one of the in-game maps, which can only be seen clearly by assuming the first-person view and checking it carefully, keeping the information you learned in mind. even situations as simple as buying things from the convenience store or any shop in the game. In most games, including Yakuza, you just talk to the clerk behind the counter and essentially order what you want from a drop-down menu. In Shenmue, all talking to the clerk gets you is small talk. To buy things from the store, then, you have to do as you would in real life. Locate the item, take it off the shelf, and bring it to the counter. Even things like the game center interactivity is much more granular than in Yakuza. In the first Yakuza, I was surprised that it seemed I could only play the UFO catcher game. In Shenmue, it has full versions of Space Harrier and Hang-On, as well as darts, 2 different kinds of darts if you go to the lounge at the harbor, and 2 different styles of QTE games to help you practice for the game's various QTE sequences. But Shenmue doesn't stop at its depth of interactivity with its world. Shenmue also has a robust built-in logic, which Yakuza doesn't have. Every single character in the world has a routine and schedule they follow. And almost every single character has a unique design from the others. I say almost in the latter part because there are a number of dock workers that do share identical character designs, but in the other 3 areas of the world, every character is unique and goes by their own daily schedule. In the mornings, you can see a big guy in a yellow shirt walking, doing errands in Dobuita, and at night, you can see him staggering home drunk in Sakuragaoka after a night at the bars. It's one of the most realistic things I've still yet to see in a video game. As someone who lives in a small city in Japan, the experiences I've personally had in Shenmue can be translated almost directly to experiences I've had in real life as far as routine sightings of local people are concerned. Even then, it doesn't stop there. I remember in 2011, when Skyrim had gamers and journalists alike in awe over, of many other things, every NPC in the game was voiced, and there were thousands of individual recorded lines for those characters in the game. Shenmue, predictably, did this first. Of course, when Shenmue came out, voice acting in games had been fairly well established at that point, but Shenmue took everything a step further by giving every unique NPC their own voice. This is not something that can be said for many games, even now. Even if we look at the most recent game in the now rebranded Like a Dragon series, Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, even this game released in 2025 does not have fully voiced NPCs. And it isn't like Shenmue doesn't have many NPCs either. Very rarely does text ever appear on the screen, including text boxes, which are omnipresent in Yakuza. Fully voiced characters aren't necessary in every adventure game, mind you. That's not what I'm saying. But rather, it adds to the idea that Shenmue is aiming for a more realistic and lifelike depiction of its world, which sets it apart rather greatly from Yakuza. Shenmue also has a day-night cycle, where every in-game day is about 40 minutes to an hour long. This wasn't anything excessively revolutionary in itself, as games like Ocarina of Time featured the same kind of system before Shenmue. And while Ocarina of Time's sequel, Majora's Mask, would introduce schedules for certain individual NPCs less than a year after Shenmue on the Nintendo 64, Shenmue's system was much broader in scale, and the fact that it exists at all, even in the shallowest of terms, is more than one can say about what's featured in Yakuza. And just to add even more to Shenmue's seemingly endless number of features, it also includes variable weather that is programmed using real weather data from that area of Japan at that time, late November through December 1986. Shenmue was technically groundbreaking at the time, and in a lot of cases includes features that many modern games still don't have, including the first Yakuza game. And this is part of what makes the point of each game different, and its difference that informs the nature of each game's gameplay. Again, pointing these differences out isn't me trying to say that Shenmue is better than Yakuza because of its closer attention to detail. I'm only trying to illustrate how the point of the depth of attention to detail in each game differs greatly, as it does because their individual goals in terms of gameplay and storytelling necessitate it. What I'm basically suggesting here is that these aren't mere flavors of the same style of game, but that these games are a lot more different than how they might appear on the surface. What is really interesting about both Shenmue and Yakuza is how their respective control schemes are derivative of how other games controlled earlier in that generation they came out of. Shenmue has been lambasted for its control scheme, but I'm going to be honest, it never bothered me. So-called tank controls seem to be nearly universally hated by gamers, and especially influencers and journalists. It's almost used as a derogatory term at this point. But as someone who grew up playing games like Resident Evil, Sonic R, or even to some extent Mega Man Legends, I really don't understand the hate tank controls get. For me, especially games like Shenmue or Mega Man Legends, lateral control of characters controls as if you were using the right analog stick to steer your character in a more modern game, basically utilizing the camera to steer your character. It's honestly kind of basic, and I really don't see the problem with the way Shenmue controls. You can either use the D-pad to move Ryo forward, or you can use the left trigger on the Dreamcast controller to move him forward. What's actually pretty cool about using the trigger to move Ryo is that because it's an analog trigger, you can actually control his travel speed as well. It's pretty cool, even though I opt to run all the time. My only complaint about this method of control is more of a critique of the ergonomics of the control method. The triggers on the Dreamcast controller are too narrow and rounded where your finger makes contact with it, so it feels a little awkward after a while. I look at the flat, wider triggers on my Saturn 3D controller in envy in that case. But besides that, this is usually how I prefer to move Ryo forward. You steer him with the D-pad, and his steering feels excellent and very modern, especially for a game from 1999. The main limitation is that Ryo is only capable of moving in the direction the camera is facing, so there's no strafe and no backwards movement. But if I'm going to be honest, the control is so intuitive and the game design hardly calls for that kind of movement, if at all, so I really didn't find myself missing it that much. One thing that is cool though is if you want Ryo to move backwards, one tap on the down direction of the D-pad will prompt Ryo to do a quick about face, which is very aesthetically gratifying in how responsive yet realistic it looks. There is a purpose for why this control method was employed, however. Since the world is so small, there is a lot of room for detail, and thus, one of the main aspects of the game is to pay attention to those small details and interact with the world in a way that is more realistic. That's what the analog stick is for. To look around, you use the analog stick, but if you want to get a closer view, holding down the right trigger will help snap the camera into a first-person mode where you can use the analog stick to look freely or use the D-pad to select what item specifically to focus on. Again, I can't help but to think that this mechanic is pretty easy to get the hang of relatively quickly, especially if you're using a Dreamcast controller, since the D-pad and analog stick are positioned in a way where they can't easily be used simultaneously in the same way a dual analog controller can. In this way, I do believe that Shenmue is more or less built perfectly around the Dreamcast control layout overall. For Yakuza, the control and play style is very different. Yakuza uses a series of fixed camera angles situated throughout the environment, and passing through each section of the world to the next leads to another, which usually changes the camera perspective relative to Kazuma. When this happens, you are actually allowed about a half second to adjust the direction you hold the analog stick to keep Kazuma moving in that direction, helping to make this movement more fluid. Basically, the system setup here is very similar to the modern setting for the Resident Evil Remake controls, I think, but with the inclusion of the ability for Kazuma to run in any direction. Basically, fixed camera angles like Resident Evil, but without the tank controls. This is actually pretty standard for the time, I think, but what I believe helps make this a deliberate choice on the part of the developers is the fact that you can find a narrative reason as to why Yakuza is presented in this way. One of the characters, the florist Sai, has a system of cameras all over the place in convenient locations throughout the in-game world. This camera system just happens to take the exact same angles of the different parts of the map that the game camera takes as well. So it can probably be said that the feeling of being watched in Resident Evil as an analogy for the omnipresent sense of horror in that game can actually be literally interpreted in Yakuza, which I thought was pretty neat. There is a much wider view of the world, and NPC density is quite high as a result. Aside from having no left analog stick control, this game plays much like any other modern game in terms of moving your character where you want them to go. There is an analog to the movement of Kazuma. You can have him walk if you push the analog stick in any direction a little bit, but there really isn't much use for that feature until Haruka starts yelling at you to wait so she can catch up during the sections where she follows Kazuma around. Indoor environments work the same way, with some sections where the camera assumes more dynamic movement, although the only way you can control it is by adjusting Kazuma's placement and orientation, which can feel a little jank at times, but nothing game-breaking and something almost imperceptible and almost second nature to anyone who is used to this era of games and their control quirks. Interacting with the world is as simple as pressing the circle button, because this is Japanese, to either talk to someone or to interact with objects as one would in a game like Pokemon or something of similar ilk. It's about as conventional as it goes, all things considered, but it is a means to an end for Yakuza. Traversal is part of the experience in as much as it is used to further the plot and help immerse the player into the game's world and offer the player side quests and opportunities to level up Kazuma. More on that later. But just because it might not be as granular as Shenmue doesn't mean the world can't be appreciated. Honestly, I was amazed by the level of graphical fidelity there was in Yakuza, especially with the lighting and colors. Sure, the character models, especially the NPCs, aren't really the most detailed and nowhere near to the extent as they are in Shenmue, but they are still impressive relative even to its renderware-powered American counterpart, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, although that game boasts a vastly larger and truly open world. The physics applied to the prizes you can win from the UFO catchers at the game center, although rudimentary by modern standards, was still pretty impressive considering that sort of thing wasn't all that common on the PlayStation 2. While Shenmue might have some advantages when it comes to graphical details, Yakuza utilizes a number of techniques that makes it look significantly more modern, which helps to give it the overall appearance of a nearly cross-generation game. Coming out in 2005, a year before the release of a PlayStation 3, this would only make sense. And here I'm talking about graphics and the controls section of the gameplay section. Oops. I guess this was all an extremely elongated way of saying that Yakuza controls exactly the way you expect it to, without the need of having to consult a manual as far as traversing the world goes. It offers interesting cinematic camera angles, and moving Kazuma around this world relative to those camera angles is very lenient from one screen to another, and is very easy to follow, even as a first-time player. If you've ever played any game with fixed camera angles, that's to say, with no camera control within the traversal scenes, it might feel a little old-fashioned, but it's far beyond the original Resident Evil games. One thing Shenmue and Yakuza have in common is that both games do break into their own dedicated fighting sequences, where you have to fight enemies either one-on-one or against large groups of enemies. That being said, however, their fighting systems are quite distinct from each other. Yakuza's fighting system controls very similarly to many other 3D brawler games. Certain button combinations can help Kazuma perform different combos that can do more damage than his standard attacks. The combos you can input are a bit limited, but this potential issue is avoided thanks to the game's leveling system, which I will go into later. Kazuma can move freely in the arenas he fights in, and he can punch, kick, throw, block, pick up items in the environment to use as weapons, disarm armed enemies and use those weapons against them, and use his heat attack once it's charged. You can also perform finishing moves depending on his positioning relative to the enemy character, what move he's executing, and where in relation to the arena's surroundings he and the enemy are. These finishing moves kind of remind me of the glory kill mechanic in Doom and Doom Eternal in that regard, and thanks to the exaggerated sound effects, motion blur, and slow motion movement, these moves never stop being satisfying to pull off. The fighting in Yakuza is actually much deeper than I would have assumed. I was expecting something more along the lines of the kind of depth you got in other, I guess, lesser games from that generation. I played quite a few brawler games released on the GameCube, like that one TMNT game and that awesome Teen Titans game, the names of which I've totally forgotten. Or even Sonic Unleashed on the Wii, honestly, or the PS3 version. Something around the depth of those games' fighting mechanics. But I was pleasantly surprised with what I got with Yakuza. There was a lot of strategy that went with that game, and as enemies and bosses got tougher, especially the enemies armed with guns, button mashing is ill-recommended and probably won't carry you very far, which I like. Your movement and ability to engage and disengage enemies is really smooth, and helps add to the depth of the combat in this game. One of the other cool things about the combat in Yakuza's combat is its demand of the player to manage their items effectively. It's likely that unless you are a master of the game, you probably won't be able to beat every boss with just one health bar, especially considering they usually follow a gauntlet of enemies beforehand with no break in between them and the boss themselves. So before every encounter, it isn't a bad idea to top yourself off with healing items. This can be anything from the various vitamin drinks to onigiri or bento boxes you can buy at the convenience store, or even alcohol as long as you don't drink too much as to impair Kazuma by making him drunk. These items can be used in fights by opening the pause menu and selecting them to be used. Each heals Kazuma a fixed amount of HP and strategically using them throughout the fight so you don't accidentally risk wasting a more expensive healing item on wounds that are not as serious unless you have enough cash late in the game to buy more of the strongest stuff. The typical brawler sections and boss fights do offer quite a bit of depth overall, and with the healing mechanic especially, it almost feels like an RPG, even though aside from that and the game's leveling system, which I'll again get to later, Yakuza is still firmly within the realm of action brawler. At least for the time being. Shenmue's fighting system is much different, as one might start to assume at this point in the video if you've made it this far. Indeed, where the similarities begin and end between Shenmue and Yakuza are with the surface level aspects of their gameplay. They each break out into their own fighting sections that are either brawler sections fighting numerous foes or a one-on-one boss fight. The main differences lie as soon as you pick up the controller though. Shenmue's system controls much more like a proper fighting game than a beat-em-up. I've heard it rumored that Shenmue's fighting system is built on the Virtua Fighter engine, though it doesn't seem likely that that is the case. From what little experience I have with Virtua Fighter, I will say that it is an overall different system than Virtua Fighter, with more simplified mechanics done so in the interest of those with little experience in fighting games and are players more inclined to play action-adventure games in lieu. Although, if Shenmue detractors are any indication, it appears that Shenmue's fighting mechanics still seem to have a certain level of depth that is abnormal for games of this style, probably especially in contrast to the kind of combat and gameplay that exists in action-adventure games of today. One thing about Shenmue's combat that really sets it apart from most games with hand-to-hand combat, including fighting games, is that it lacks a dedicated block button. At first, that seems like a pretty odd omission, but once you discover that you have a dodge button that is almost as effective at avoiding damage as the roll in Dark Souls, you start to not miss your inability to block enemy attacks. Shenmue does contain a large number of combos you can perform based on different button combinations you input. The simplest combos you can do are the kick and punch ones, which simply require you to press the kick and or punch buttons multiple times in rapid succession. Combinations can get more complex once you add in multiple simultaneous button presses, as well as the addition of directional combinations as well. At this point, Shenmue's fighting system is already quite a bit deeper than what is offered in Yakuza, but things do get a little more complicated. New moves can only be learned either through training or unlocked through cutscenes with certain characters at certain points in the story, through finding the move scrolls, or by buying them at one of the antique shops. This is the only way you can unlock Ryo's ability to perform new moves, but I believe that even if they are moves you probably won't use or are in some way disadvantageous to use in a fight, they are still worth having, since if you're coming from Shenmue to Shenmue 2 on Dreamcast, you can take all those moves and your stats with you to your Shenmue 2 save. Everything in Shenmue's fighting system is completely manual, so if there is a certain throw or kick you want to do, you must input the right combo to perform it and time it just right. Sometimes being able to perform certain moves can be a stroke of luck, but Shenmue does not really reward button mashing at all. I don't know if it's even possible to button mash considering the amount of windup it can take for Ryo to perform a move, and things become even more complicated when bigger moves can be interrupted with a well-placed attack by enemies. During training, you are given the option to map one of your combos to the right trigger if it turns out to be a move you want to use frequently without needing to put in the correct combination every time to execute it. Although for me at least, I hardly ever used it. Some moves are really useful in some contexts as opposed to others. For example, one type of move I found extremely useful when taking on a large group of enemies attacking as a collective was a large sweeping kick move of any kind. This could be anything from the kind of kick from pressing the kick button 3 times, the tornado kick, which is 2 sweeping kicks back to back, the back kick move, which is extremely useful for crowd control, and the trigger kick, the left trigger kick I should say, which is also incredibly useful. These combos don't necessarily do any more damage than your standard attacks, despite how they might look, but as tools for certain situations, they can be incredibly useful, especially considering Ryo doesn't wield any kind of weaponry, nor does he use any healing items like Kazuma can. Shenmue's HP system is very different in that Ryo's health bar replenishes by itself over time gradually, but even more so, it seems anyway, the more hits you can land on an enemy. This is a pretty interesting mechanic and does help add to the tension of battles, since once Ryo's health starts to get lower, you must not act out of desperation in fights, but instead continue to think about your strategy and rethink the timing of your attacks. Every failure to beat a boss or defeat a group of enemies, like in the 70-man bout, was entirely my fault. It's actually the 70-man bout and the final boss, Chai, who really tests your skills at the fighting mechanics in the game, and it is incredibly satisfying to be able to finally beat them when you do, because no matter what, it was a victory you earned. But Shenmue's fighting mechanics aren't without its flaws, but funnily enough, that's where we see another similarity between Shenmue and Yakuza. The biggest flaw between both Yakuza and Shenmue's fighting mechanics is the fact that there isn't a way to focus on a single enemy when multiple are involved in a fight. One could argue this issue is inexcusable in both cases, since games like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and even the aforementioned Mega Man Legends both feature their own lock-on mechanics to help focus the character on a single target. But this problem can be dealt with in each game by utilizing their unique mechanics to the player's advantage. For Yakuza, this issue can be minimized by using a large weapon of some kind that Kazuma can swing in a large arc, or can simply get Kazuma to completely disengage and run to a different part of the arena to force the enemy AI to stack up in a neat row so you can take them on more effectively. In Shenmue, it's a little trickier since Ryo barely breaks his fighting stance, and so it isn't as easy to make distance from large groups of enemies. This is where I'd either opt to spam the dodge button in one direction, or if I'm surrounded, use one of my crowd control methods to put some space between Ryo and some of the attackers. These aren't perfect solutions to problems that probably shouldn't have been there to begin with, but at least it still forces the player to really think about the fighting mechanics they do have at their disposal to deal with these types of difficult situations during combat. Your mileage may vary, of course, with regards to which type of system you prefer, since neither are completely favorable, but having extensive experience with this kind of, as I like to call it, 6th gen jank, I really don't find myself being too worried about it most of the time, though that isn't really an excuse for a problem that was solved in the 5th generation of consoles, but I digress. Both Shenmue and Yakuza have their own RPG-light systems when it comes to leveling up Ryo and Kazuma's abilities in their respective games. In Yakuza, the system is pretty straightforward. Kazuma has 3 stats you can upgrade, one for his strength and basic attacks, the other in HP, which will increase his maximum HP, and the other for leveling up your heat action attack. You earn the ability to upgrade these stats through gaining experience points, which Kazuma is awarded after every successful combat encounter. The stats are upgraded by spending these experience points and can be allocated manually by the player. Me being the way I am, I tend to go for an all-rounder type of character, so that's what I opted to do for this playthrough. As stats level up, the cost of leveling them up also increases, and it becomes increasingly necessary to fight tougher enemies in order to gain more experience quicker. Yakuza has something akin, but not completely congruent, to a random encounter system. Because Kazuma is such a big shot, a lot of low-level thugs and rival Yakuza will try to chase him down and attempt to ambush him. Most of the combat in the game takes place in these settings, and at first can be extremely helpful in being able to earn extra experience points for Kazuma that can then be used to level up his fighting stats. However, later in the game, it becomes more and more apparent that the experience points these fights yield are increasingly insufficient as Kazuma grows stronger, and leveling up these stats becomes more expensive. The way boss strength scales as the story progresses, grinding out these small fry enemies ends up being more of a waste of time than anything productive in making Kazuma strong enough to fight bosses and large groups of their underlings later in the game. Luckily, however, there is a solution. The florist Sai owns a huge underground business that involves gambling and hostess services on top of his constant surveillance of the area thanks to his hidden network of cameras. But the biggest part of his business is the Colosseum. It's here at the Colosseum where you can earn big experience points to rapidly level up Kazuma's stats to make him more than strong enough to face later enemy gauntlets and bosses. It does require a bit of a grind if you choose to do all the tournaments at once like I did, but the reward is huge for doing so. You get to immensely upgrade Kazuma's stats. You can become more familiar with the fighting mechanics of the game, and the payout for winning each tournament is very high compared to the random street fights Kazuma is involved in. Yeah, money also becomes important in Yakuza as well, and everything I said about stats and earning experience points can be said about earning money as well. Because of this fact, there is some grinding that might be necessary, but the gameplay loop is so satisfying for me that I personally didn't mind it, hence, don't mind the grind. I mentioned before that this Colosseum grind can help players become more attuned with the fighting mechanics. That's not just a question of getting better acquainted with the controls and fighting mechanics themselves, but also gives the player exposure to the different fighting styles, different enemies Kazuma will encounter later on in the game. One thing I neglected to mention in the previous section is that there are a number of different fighting styles enemies can use against you, and each of these requires a different approach and strategy to combating them. The Colosseum gives the player the ability to figure out how best to deal with the different fighting styles so that once they are met with them in more plot-sensitive bouts, they will be able to approach combat with them appropriately. This is especially when Kazuma is faced with a number of enemies all coming at him with unique fighting styles. It tests the player's ability to prioritize which enemies to go for and when, and strategize their movement in the arenas and the timing of their attacks, on top of which attacks are most effective to use against which enemies of which fighting style. In a way, it kind of reminds me, again, of the newer Doom games, except much easier and much slower. it does add a surprising amount of depth to the fighting gameplay. In a way, grinding Kazuma's stats in the Colosseum can also be a way for the player to sharpen their skills in a similar way, which is kind of a cool way to make leveling up feel more than just an in-game progression. Shenmue's leveling system is more seamlessly interwoven into the game's world and is so subtle that many first-time players don't even realize it exists. Shenmue does not have a traditional leveling or experience points system like Yakuza. Instead, it relies on the player's understanding of their knowledge of the fact that Ryo is a martial artist in training, and that the way you build strength is by practicing. Early in the game, there is a lot of potential dead time where Ryo is required to wait, sometimes a whole day before the next story event happens. Many people who don't understand the point of this end up just wasting time by letting the day play out without doing anything. But this is obviously not what this time is meant for. While there are a number of activities you can do, like go to the game center and play darts, QTE Hero, Space Harrier or Hang On, or put your luck to the test at Pachinko Slot or Gacha Capsule games, one of the activities that this time is very much meant for is training. As I mentioned before, Ryo learns many of his basic moves through simply performing them while practicing. Ryo practices his moves by going into any of the designated places like empty parks, parking lots, or the Hazuki Dojo and triggering a training event which puts the game into fighting mode, where you can practice inputting combos to unlock Ryo's basic moves. For even the most casual fighting game players out there, this mode really is no different from practice mode in games like Dead or Alive, for instance, where the whole point is to practice inputting different combos to pull off more advanced attacks and techniques that can be useful in certain situations during real fights. The combos in Shenmue are pretty simple, and it is pretty easy to get them down in the practice sessions. But unlocking the moves isn't enough. You will need to make them stronger. You make these moves stronger by performing them repeatedly. Doing this will fill a bar, which, once it reaches a certain threshold, will level up the move and its strength and sometimes lead to Ryo doing a more complicated move as an evolution for it to make it even more useful in combat scenarios. This is definitely the grindiest part of Shenmue, however, and it does require a bit of patience to build up Ryo's strength. But there is something satisfying about being able to perform the same combo in a continuous string. It again gives the potential to make the player feel as though they themselves are also becoming better at performing these more complex moves as Ryo. This is further compounded by the fact that the more these moves are performed, the stronger they get. And while yes, this does include during combat scenarios as well, those aren't necessarily enough unless you're just really good at the combat in Shenmue. I don't know, but once I got into the final part of the game where I had gotten Ryo's stats on my favorite moves strong enough to the point where they could totally body enemies that would have taken a lot more effort to beat up earlier in the game, never stops feeling amazing. I also found a kind of poetic justice in being able to use the first move Ryo is taught to use as the finishing move against Chai at the end of the game, or using the tornado kick to finish off Terry during my initial playthrough of the HD versions, which I unfortunately did not record. But if you get why, you get it. That's what I love about Shenmue's leveling system. It is as integrated and grounded into the world as everything else about Shenmue is, and it does so much to make the growth of Ryo's strength feel organic in a way I haven't really experienced in any other game. While this isn't the only grind in Shenmue, it is the only grind related to specifically leveling up Ryo's fighting strength. But once again, here lies the difference between these two games, where one draws its leveling mechanic from more conventional, easy to understand means, the other, consistent with its theme of being totally immersive in every aspect of its gameplay, utilizes a more unique system that isn't as apparent as some RPG enthusiasts might be used to, unless they are really paying attention to the game and applying a real-world logic to it and its systems. In simpler terms, these games' leveling systems are worlds apart as a result of their overall direction as it relates to their level of attention to detail. Yakuza doesn't really offer many alternative gameplay styles, but it does have one other that shows up just once towards the end of the game. After saving Haruka and meeting Kazama for the last time until he is eventually assassinated for real this time, you are at first of the idea you're home free, driving home on the highway, until your driver realizes that you are being followed. This turns into a chase sequence where Kazuma is given a gun and needs to gun down all the guys giving chase before they either kill Kazuma or kill the getaway car. This part of the game, I'm not going to lie, is the lowest point in terms of gameplay. It might be because I'm so used to mouse aiming at this point, but the aiming in this section just felt excessively numb. There's a ducking mechanic, but you are required to be quick with taking out these enemies before they immobilize your car. It's very frustrating, and sometimes I swore I was hitting a guy despite the fact that the game wasn't registering the hit. This section isn't extremely long or anything, but I definitely didn't feel like it was short in the moment. I know I'm not exactly being objective here, but this section came so out of left field and felt so unpleasant to play. I understood why it was added. It definitely doesn't feel like padding or anything. It has its place, but I felt it was a complete missed opportunity, and I couldn't help but to feel like it was built around the same mechanics as the fighting sections, considering the fact that there's no lock-on option. You are also responsible for reloading Kazuma's weapon, which isn't a terrible mechanic, but reloading feels like a chore when this whole section just feels as though you are fighting the controls the whole way. Luckily, the enemies spawn in the same way with the same timing, so luckily repeated deaths can help you memorize their patterns so that you can anticipate their movements before they happen and adjust Kazuma's aim accordingly. It's just a real shame because I do get strong Virtua Cop vibes here, and this could have been so much more exciting. Again, at least it only shows up once in the game, so it's not a massive blemish, but it is a blemish nonetheless. Shenmue has a number of different gameplay styles, and Shenmue being Shenmue, of course there are in-world ways to prepare for them in Ryo's excessive free time during the game's first third. Since we're coming from the topic of car chases and highways, let's talk about the driving sections first. Shenmue is notorious for its third act being dominated by Ryo working a part-time job at Yokosuka Harbor as a forklift driver. At the beginning of each workday, everyone lines up their forklifts on a starting grid and races 3 laps around a makeshift track built around naturally occurring obstacles at the harbor. It isn't necessary to win these races, but it does help to teach the player how to handle them when work actually starts. The racing is really quite simple, since the forklifts actually corner similarly to Ryo while he's running. It's hard to explain, but it's like a rotation that has a certain rate of acceleration the longer you hold down the direction you're turning in. The right trigger is used to accelerate, and because it's analog, you can modulate your speed if you want. Braking is used with the left trigger, and from a complete stop, the left trigger will put the forklift into reverse. You can raise and lower the lift itself by using the A button. I found that racing with the fork lifted makes navigating the corners easier, since even brushing up against any of the obstacles brings you to a near standstill. Of course, steering is controlled using the D-pad, although there is a chance that the analog stick could also be used, though I never personally tried it. It really isn't necessary with the fork, since you probably want to go full tilt Need for Speed style the whole way if you want to win. This isn't the only time Ryo operates a vehicle, though. Going back to the theme of running at high speeds on a highway at night, in the section where Nozomi is kidnapped by the Mad Angels, Ryo has to reach the harbor by 3 a.m. or else they will do something to her. Because the bus isn't running, Ryo has to borrow Yuji's motorcycle. Again, Yuji is a real bro. No questions asked, just lets him have it. So of course, you have to pilot the motorcycle down the highway going fast, but not too fast so you avoid hitting walls and being slowed down as a result. The controls for this section are the same as any other driving section, except I know you can use the analog stick here, and it is strongly recommended since there are turns that sometimes start out shallow and get sharper gradually, and the analog stick is much more apt for that kind of input that sort of obstacle necessitates. A first-time player who is opting to bum rush the game's ending might come away thinking that this section is entirely out of left field, and this would be true if they didn't bother getting any practice in their free time beforehand. How do you practice? Well, with Hang On at the Game Center, of course. This section controls very similarly to Hang On, and while you don't have to be particularly good at Hang On in order to be successful navigating the highway racing to Nozomi's rescue, Ryo and the Game Center owner know that I'm terrible at Hang On. It does help you get the feel for modulating your speed and how driving a motorcycle feels in this game. This is one of my favorite sequences in Shenmue because it is so different from everything else in the game, and it is equally as exciting since there is a ticking clock that seems to count down to the last second as soon as you make it to the harbor. It feels like something out of a Sega arcade game from this time period, and it's really great. Plus, the cutscene that plays after you rescue Nozomi from the Mad Angels makes this whole sequence all the more worth it. Action and excitement relieved by the only moment in the game where you are allowed to put down the controller and just enjoy the scene. Shenmue has a ton of cutscenes, but very rarely do the longer ones ever allow you to just watch what's going on. And thus we get to one of the other gameplay styles in Shenmue, the QTE sections. QTEs receive quite a lot of negative press these days, thanks to their misuse by developers who put them in games to give players the illusion that what they are playing is really interactive when it is really a fully scripted scene playing out. They have been used in many games as a lazy way to incorporate gameplay into overly long cutscenes and have unfairly earned their reputation as being somewhat superfluous. This isn't entirely fair though, since I do feel that when done properly, QTEs can have their place in games, especially action-adventure games. Shenmue is an example of QTEs done extraordinarily well. I would even venture to say that they are the best examples of QTEs I've yet experienced. Not only are they very cleanly integrated into the cutscenes themselves, but in later parts of the game, they can actually lead to alternative conclusions to scenes. What's also neat about the QTEs is you don't need to have a 100% success rate with every input. Shenmue does allow for mistakes to happen and an animation will play accordingly, but continue the scene with more QTEs to follow. This means that there is a distinct possibility that no two QTE segments upon repeat playthroughs will look exactly the same, which is pretty cool, I think. The QTEs are a bit of a highlight in Shenmue and allow for more interactive cutscene action as a result, be they chases or barroom brawls. A lot of the time I would find myself caught totally off guard by these QTEs since I was so used to the idea of just setting down the controller and watching the cutscenes like in other games. After all, Shenmue's cutscene presentations were so advanced for their time, they are kind of mesmerizing to watch even now, and I found myself so consistently taken by the cinematography and dialogue that once a QTE would hit, I would totally fail the whole sequence the first time. But once I got used to the idea that Shenmue demands active player engagement, the QTEs on my second playthrough became something I was able to both anticipate and enjoy in an unbroken cutscene kind of way. Most of the time. As a bit of an addendum to the don't mind the grind section, as well as the forklift racing section, I should also mention Ryo's forklift job. After all, that's why Ryo has any business operating a forklift to begin with. Of course, the forklift drives the exact same way during the working time as it does during the race. The goal here is to transport crates from one area to another area designated by that day's shipping needs. You have a minimum quota of crates that must be moved, and Ryo is paid his wage per crate moved. If Ryo meets or exceeds that day's quota, he gets a raise for the next day's work. Maybe it's just me, but I always found it really easy to get locked into this aspect of the game. Once you've gotten your route down and have gotten into the groove of the workflow, it can be kind of addicting. I found myself always surpassing the daily quota and sometimes finishing moving all the crates before the working time is over. It is a daily grind though. It's quite repetitive except for the number of crates you move and where you move them and how. But every day is mostly the same for several days until Ryo is eventually fired. The only issue I ran into was mostly due to a lack of visibility directly in front of the forklift, especially when carrying a crate. It's easy to get into head-on collisions with other forklifts, and the draw distance for NPCs in Shenmue being as short as it is means you can often find yourself running into pedestrians who are still slowly rendering in. Since merely brushing up against obstacles brings your forklift to a near complete halt, this can be a little frustrating, especially if you're trying to move all the crates. Not that that really matters for the plot of the game, but I care about it for some reason. Upon writing this script's conclusion, I was reminded of another gameplay style in Shenmue that I actually really didn't like all that much. At the beginning of Act 2, or Disc 2 I suppose, Ryo has to sneak his way to Old Warehouse number 8 in the Old Warehouse district of Yokosuka Harbor. This would have been totally unnecessary if Ryo simply gave his name to Guijong Chen over the phone so security could just let him in, but how is Ryo supposed to know? I mean, how is I supposed to know? Anyway, it makes narrative sense that Ryo would have to play out this scenario, but man, this is no Metal Gear Solid or Splinter Cell, or even Ocarina of Time for that matter. It's at night, and it's pitch dark. The only thing you can see is whatever little bits of scenery Ryo's flashlight illuminates, and the spots of light from the patrolling security guards' flashlights. You can also hear their footsteps, which utilize the stereo soundscape really well. Unfortunately, this gameplay style as a whole feels quite a bit half-baked. There is really only one surefire way to avoid being caught by security, since they roam in repetitive patterns that kind of fall in and out of sync with each other. Ryo is able to find cover, but if the angle is wrong, security will find Ryo, and if he's caught, he will be thrown out and forced to try again the next night. If you fail enough times, the homeless man will give you a map of the security patrol routes and where warehouse number 8 is. If you keep failing, eventually the homeless man will tell you that after 11 p.m., the number of patrolling security decreases, making it potentially easier to sneak into the warehouse. The problem I have is the fact that Shenmue's lighting engine really isn't up to snuff, and because Shenmue insists on maintaining the camera's fixed position behind Ryo, it can be almost impossible to tell where you are in the area on the map without getting right up against the wall. This is really the one section where the controls for moving Ryo around feels excessively clunky, since they're not exactly conducive to sneaking around and running away from security. You can get away from them, but it isn't easy, especially if while being chased you run into another security guard. This section is so frustrating, and while it is a relief that there is one surefire way to be potentially successful on a first attempt, the fact that that seems to be the only way to be potentially successful on a first attempt also tells me that maybe this section could have used more time in the oven. Luckily, it's the only stealth section in the game, and while it isn't a particularly big part of the whole game, more so the main action set piece of Disc 2, it's still a section that I wish adopted a system that was more adept to this style of gameplay. Free roaming eyes entertainment is kind of an antiquated, arbitrary genre of game that really never took off as a genre term, being locked to only the first 2 Shenmue games. Because of this, FREE, or free, never caught on, and instead Shenmue is commonly placed in the action-adventure genre. Action-adventure as a genre is a pretty general term that houses a number of different games, some of which can be fit under different subgenres, while others exist in a more vague limbo, or purgatory, depending on how you look at it. Unfortunately, it's that purgatory games like Shenmue, Yakuza, Grand Theft Auto, Tomb Raider, Alan Wake, Uncharted, etc. all fall under. Despite this, everyone can look at Tomb Raider and Grand Theft Auto and judge them as distinct from one another. Even Yakuza and Grand Theft Auto don't share that much in common. Despite this, it's hard to find someone talking about either Shenmue or Yakuza without mentioning the other, even in a passing sense, to use as some point of comparison. But really, these games couldn't be more different from each other than they already are, and I believe it all boils down to the fact that Shenmue is much more driven by being as immersive and realistic as possible, including finding logical real-world solutions for in-game problems. Things like checking the local map to help the old lady find the Yamamoto residence, or physically pushing the buttons for the drink you want in the vending machine by controlling Ryo's hand, or increasing Ryo's fighting strength by taking time out of the day to practice and drill the moves over and over. Is the room dark? Turn on a light. No electricity? Light some candles or go to the store and buy a light bulb. Can't reach a high place? Push the stool over so you can reach what you want. The kitten is hungry? Find some dried fish or some squid at the convenience store and feed it to the kitten. Need a phone number's area code location? Check the phone book. It goes on and on. but it all makes perfect sense, and the game never leaves you high and dry if you get lost, because hints can be just one conversation with an NPC or consultation of Ryo's notebook away. All of the answers to all of anyone's questions can be found in the game simply by paying attention to the details of the world the game is actively providing. Yakuza's systems are much more conventional in comparison, and compared to Shenmue, much more gamey, but that is also the point. Yakuza is going in a different direction than Shenmue and obviously has different ambitions with the story it wants to tell. It doesn't go to the level of Shenmue's attention to detail because it doesn't have to. In the same way, Shenmue chooses its level of depth because that is the whole point of the game. It's meant to be slower. It has a smaller scale story it's trying to tell, but it has a lot more to say about this small chapter it's telling, so it will take its time to tell it to the level of detail it wishes. Neither game is wrong for not doing what the other does, so it feels a bit erroneous when accusations are thrown at Shenmue for being bad because it's not more like Yakuza, or that Shenmue fans were foolish to wait so long for Shenmue 3 to release when they could have been playing the Yakuza games instead. Yes, on the surface, Shenmue and Yakuza appear to be very similar. They are both action-adventure games featuring male protagonists who take part in hand-to-hand combat with thugs in realistically depicted immersive recreations of very specific areas of Japan. They tell stories that are very Japanese and both produced by development teams in Sega. Toshihiro Nagoshi of Yakuza series fame even played a major role in the development of the first Shenmue. Both are heavily story-driven and are unique in the side of Japan that they depict. However, these aspects alone are too surface level to judge them as comparable in any more substantial terms. Metroid is kind of overhyped by its fans, and really it's the Mega Man games that do everything Metroid is attempting to do in a way that better respects the player's time. Did that sound absurd? Why? Metroid and Mega Man are both side-scrolling platform games that involve a main character with an arm cannon whose adventures are completely non-linear and player-driven. Each character, as they progress through the game, attain new weapons and items that augment their abilities and attack power so that they can defeat the final boss and more challenging late-game challenges. Mega Man's style is much more streamlined. All you have to do is choose the next robot master you want to face, and you are instantly beamed to that area with a clear direction you're meant to run in. In Metroid, you waste a potentially gargantuan amount of time roaming around the world, sometimes aimlessly, looking for a clue as to where to go next. You can finish a Mega Man game within a couple of hours on an initial playthrough without a guide. All it takes is a little bit of persistence. Metroid can take much longer, and some of those games are so easy to get lost in, you kind of wonder why it can't just be structured more like Mega Man. At least Mega Man's difficulty is directly tied to player skill rather than accidentally wandering into an area you didn't know you weren't supposed to be in yet and falling into a yet impassable pit, or being bodied by stronger enemies, or even dying because in getting lost your HP has been slowly chipped away at by enemies you encountered while trying to figure out where you are and where you are going. Nobody is making these arguments, and they border on bad faith. But that's the closest example I can find to comparisons between Shenmue and Yakuza. On the surface, they seem quite similar, but the fact is that they are completely different games, just like Metroid and Mega Man. The main difference here is that Metroid and Mega Man enjoy being placed under subgenres of platformer that are distinct from one another. Mega Man is an action platformer and Metroid is a Metroidvania. The point of Metroid is its deeper exploration, in the same way the point of Shenmue is its attention to detail and immersion. To take away those aspects of each game to conform them to Mega Man and Yakuza respectively is to completely change their original intent. Just because one style is more streamlined doesn't make it correct or more respectful of players' time. It really all boils down to player preference and/or expectations. It's okay not to like one or the other. It's okay to prefer one to the other, or to not particularly like either. Not every style of game is for everybody, but that doesn't make those games failures at what they do. Maybe failures in mass market appeal, if that's what they're after, but both Shenmue and Yakuza are wholly mechanically sound and execute their individual visions successfully in their own way. And that's really the key here. I'm one of those rare examples of people, it seems, who can say that they genuinely found great enjoyment in both games by meeting them at their level and playing them by their rules. Neither game is perfect. Each has their own mechanical and technical faults. There is quite a bit of stutter in Yakuza between camera angle changes within larger open areas, possibly due to the fact that there are some assets streaming from the disc since the PS2 has famously limited memory. Shenmue suffers from unstable frame rates, and the game will occasionally encounter instances of slowdown whenever the scene becomes particularly busy, especially in Dobuita in the afternoon. Yakuza has a shooting section that borders on unbearably clunky, and Shenmue has a frustratingly haphazard stealth section. Both games are lacking a much-needed lock-on system for targeting individual enemies in a crowd to help focus their characters' attacks in brawling sections. Despite these flaws, they each are still, by my metrics at least, highly successful in what they achieve by their end, and I can't really complain about that. I played both of these games several months apart from one another in order to have the clearest idea of their similarities and differences, and the depth to which those similarities and differences reach. But I remember texting my brother while playing both of these games something to the effect of, "This is the best game ever made," and I think that's the beauty of interacting with these games and experiencing them for what they are. I feel especially lucky that I was able to come away from both of these games feeling that I had experienced something of a truly high caliber from Sega that wasn't Sonic or a game forever trapped in the world of arcades or the Sega Saturn. And while Yakuza would see much greater commercial success than Shenmue would continue to be a beloved series by those in its niche audience in a similar way that the PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast are both GOATs. But one was very niche and the other was immensely successful in the mainstream. But if you think this is the end, however, you are mistaken. In the next chapter of this sub-series, whenever it will be, we will compare their follow-ups to see if these games got any more similar or any more different in their sequels. It may or may not be as long as this video, depending on how much can be said about either game. Shenmue 2 vs. Yakuza 2 will be that video. Shenmue 2 vs. Yakuza 2 will be the video that will decide whether or not I will regret not cramming them into this video alongside their prequels. Until we meet again, keep retro-maxing. Oh yeah!